how do you live a lifestyle of evangelism? How do we become people who have that kind of not only fire within us, but the ability to translate that fire outside of us into other people, right? I don't know if you guys have ever met someone like someone that I described, someone who can just so easily share in such a kind and, I guess, graceful way with someone. But I got some friends that I try to learn from, and they can just so easily, just from an overflow place, share the verse that meant so much to them today, to just random strangers on the bus or that they're playing a sport with, and those people they share with don't try to kill them. You know what I mean? Like, that's what we think is going to happen in our minds, but they are genuinely like, wow, that actually means a lot. Like, maybe I don't agree with you, maybe I do, but tell me more about what you just shared with me. And so we want to talk today about how we become more people like that, how we more and more start to emulate and look like Christ. So let's start off at the beginning. Let's start with some definitions. Ethan, could you define for us, from your perspective, what it means to live a lifestyle of evangelism? What is that? What does it mean? All that kind of stuff.
Lifestyle of evangelism just means that as you're living your life, you share the gospel when opportunities present themselves, and maybe sometimes you even try to finagle an opportunity. Maybe it's not specifically presenting itself, but you're like, I'm going to share with this person. I've had times where I've been talking to people or there's coworkers, and we'll get into stories later, but I'll be like, I'm going to share the gospel with this person eventually. Like, they don't know it, but they're going to get it.
Happen.
And yeah, pretty much every job I've ever had. When I was a welder, worked at a coffee shop for a little bit. Now I'm in insurance. Everyone knows me as like a follower of Jesus and will get talked to about that. And it's one of the most fun because I'm like, you're a captive audience. What are you going to do? You can't leave me. You work with me. You're going to see me tomorrow. You have to be nice to me. I don't have to.
That's so funny.
Most people are nice. So basically, all that means is you're sharing your faith or your experiences or things that you're learning in the Bible with people around you just as a normal part of your life. But the problem is some people don't even know if that's something that should be part of their life. So if you say that, they're going to be like, wait, I have to do that? And then they're going to be like, wait, how often? So Derry, do you have any more comments about lifestyle evangelism? And then how often should they do that? And even should they? Is that something they have to do as a Christian?
Yeah, I think that's good. I don't really have any other comments on a definition. I think people understand that. That was a good definition you gave. Sharing your faith simply as a lifestyle. So not necessarily blocking out time for it, but to the people that you live around, to your next door neighbors, to the person that lives down the street, to the person you buy food from, to the person you work with, to your family and friends that you see at Thanksgiving and other family events, gatherings. Are you sharing your faith, right? Are you representing Christ? So yeah, good definition. And then how often do I have to do it? I would say if we're talking about like how often do I have to have scheduled evangelism times, right? I don't think you have to have scheduled evangelism times. If that's what you want to do and make those a part of your practice so that you get better at doing evangelism, you get some of that fear away from it. Maybe that's something you need to set up for your own life, right? Maybe you need to set up those times where you can practically go out and just talk to a stranger because maybe that's less intimidating for you than, I don't know, your mom or a cousin or a coworker or something like that. Just to get over that fear so that you can talk to those people. But I think most Christians know on the how often do we have to do it kind of a thing that every Christian gets to do evangelism, right? I would say you
get to. It's not a have to, it's a get to.
I have to do evangelism would be problematic, not because you have to necessarily, right? It's not like you have to do that kind of thing, but if you love the Lord, you'll obey his commandments, right? If you're loving him, you're going to obey his commandments. And the emphasis in that statement is not, I got to obey these commandments so that I love the Lord, right? It's an overflow of a love from the Lord will cause you to obey his commandments, right? If you love the Lord, the product of you loving the Lord, the action of loving the Lord, the product that comes from it will be that you're obeying his commandments, right? And so if you're like, well, I have to do evangelism. Well, you shouldn't think like that, right? You shouldn't do evangelism. Honestly, you probably shouldn't be the one sharing the gospel with someone if your attitude is, I have to share the gospel, right?
Wow, because I might push back on that a little bit, but go ahead.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but go ahead. I'll explain later.
Because if you're not loving the Lord, I don't trust you. I don't trust the overflow that's coming from your heart to evangelize to somebody else. You know what I mean? I think you could say the right things. You could articulate the gospel in a good way, and maybe that would be good. Maybe God can use that. I think he can, right? But on average, I want the person that's sharing the gospel to be coming from a place of, I love the Lord so much that I want to obey his commands and I want to share, right? Like Matthew talks about. I want to share the gospel with people because it comes from a place of wanting to share, not I have to share. You know what I mean? Maybe there's times in your life where you're just feeling down, or you're feeling burdened, or you're tired, or something like that. And we'll kind of get to that question a little later. And there might be times where you feel like, oh, I have to share. But I think for that person, for the average Christian that's in that place that has a lifestyle of evangelism already, it still partially comes from a place of, I love the Lord. And so even though I don't feel great right now, my love for him remains. So I'm going to remain in my actions of loving him and keeping his commands and sharing the gospel with people. So I'd say, I think you do like have to do it, air quotes. And then how often? I would say, how often are you reading the Bible? How often are you getting filled up, right? And as often as your tank is filled, you want to let it flow onto other people, right? It's just a natural progression, a natural cycle of, are you spending time with the Lord every day? Then that will naturally overflow into your relationships with people. You're naturally going to want to share, I would say, honestly, every day in some kind of way, whether that's doing direct evangelism of sharing the gospel with someone straight up, or discipling a fellow Christian, encouraging someone. Like, your time with the Lord, your time invested and spent in on that relationship is only going to cause you to overflow into other people's lives naturally. So I don't know if you need to schedule a how often necessarily. Maybe that's necessary for some people to get that discipline into them. But if you have a good discipline of loving the Lord, investing in that relationship often, then I would say it's going to naturally just cause you to do evangelism, and you don't have to worry about how often necessarily.
Okay, so
Ethan,
the
what do you
reason,
think about that?
the only thing I'd push back on is saying that you shouldn't do it if you're not like compelled, like with like the, like, oh, I'm so in the presence of God, I really got to share. I think you can be like, I don't really want to share, but I'm going to. And it's like not dependent on where you're at emotionally or spiritually with the Lord, but it's like, you know the truth, you should share that truth. And the reason I say that is because I think our habits help form our loves, and I don't think our loves form our habits. I think we grow to love the things that we spend time doing, whether that's like, so with working out, right? Someone might hate the gym, and I would tell them, you have to go to the gym. You have to lift weights. It doesn't got to be a lot, but you got to get there and you got to do something. And then over time, they will learn to love the gym because their body will realize how good it is for them, and they'll want more of that, and then they'll just fall in love with the gym. Same thing with spending time with the Lord or reading the Bible. When I was a youth student, someone told me that if you don't want to read the Bible, I don't think you should in that moment because you're not going to love it. So you should only read it when you love it. And I thought that was profound advice when I was a kid. I was like, holy cow, that's crazy. I've never been told that. I was told, like, no matter what, read it. Now as an adult, I'm like, even if you don't want to, you should read it. Like, it's not this is a non-negotiable. You got to do the
You
things.
reading it's going to change you wanting to read it 100%.
Right, exactly. And so you sharing the gospel is going to change you wanting to share the gospel. And so maybe if you're in a bad mood, don't share it. That's wise. You know, you don't want to look like a jerk presenting the love of God, you know? Or if you're just like in a place where you're just like, oh, I'm just so overwhelmed and stressed, I can't calm down. It's like, yeah, don't share it. Don't do that. But if you're just kind of like, I'm having a pretty good day and I'm not like super overwhelmed by the presence of God right now, but I won't share it. I'm like, nah, I think you still should. And yeah, I think our habits form our loves. And so if you can try to look for opportunities to share it, then you should. And that's that's about the end of the pushback. With the agreement side, I'd say, yeah, you don't have to.
Can I respond to that really fast?
Yeah.
Too? Just to get your perspective on this, do you think that it works the same way for something that fills you versus something you're pouring out on? Because in my perspective of like, I read the Bible, not because I want to sometimes, but because when I read it, I learn that I want to again, because it's something that fills me. Where evangelism doesn't necessarily fill me. It's like me pouring out what I've already been filled in to somebody. And so I don't know if it works the same way. Sometimes after I do evangelism, I'm like, okay, yeah, that was great. Didn't feel like it, but I did it anyway. But I already had the love there.
Mhm.
In my mind, the person that I was referencing is someone that isn't actively loving the Lord. They're not obeying God's commandments. And so I
Mm.
don't want someone who's not loving the Lord, not like obeying his commandments to evangelize. I want them to love the Lord so that they'll then obey his
Okay.
commandments.
Yeah, I'd
Does that
agree
make
with
sense?
that. Yeah, if someone's living a pretty lukewarm life or their lifestyle isn't obvious that they're in love with Jesus, I'm like, yeah, you shouldn't be sharing the gospel. My
Mm,
coworker, she told me that. Um, Actually, I won't tell the story because I don't know if they're ever going to watch it, and it's a kind of personal story, so I won't say that. But all that to say, basically, the moral of the story is my coworker had a couple run-ins with some hypocritical Christians, and she was kind of like, I don't want anything to do with church and Jesus if this is how it is.
mm,
Um, and I told her, I was like, man, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Like, I totally understand why you would feel that way, and this is why we
mhm.
started the podcast. It's for people who
Yeah.
have these frustrations. But what was I gonna say? Oh yeah, if someone's not loving Jesus with their life and they like in the worst extreme are getting drunk on the weekends and sleeping around and they're dealing drugs and but they're like, I go to church on Sunday. It's like you shouldn't share the faith. You're probably
Mhm.
not a Christian.
Not good representation.
So yeah, you're
Yeah.
probably barely saved. So you definitely shouldn't be sharing. You should listen to what's being shared and repent. Um,
Mhm.
and so I was looking at it as like a pretty active Christian, someone who has a good discipleship, good
Mhm.
rhythms, good Bible habits. They just don't do evangelism. But
For
yeah,
sure.
so I would agree with
They
what
should.
what you were saying. But yeah, if someone's just like, hey, I got my quiet time down, I spend time with God every
Mhm.
day, and listen to worship music, and I post about my Bible studies on Instagram, and they're just not doing evangelism. I'm like, you got it. You should just kick it up a notch.